Hi, my name is Kirsten Safakis, and I'm a Community Involvement Coordinator for the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. I'd like to welcome you to this virtual public meeting regarding the proposed Statement of Basis for the NIPSCO Bailey Generating Facility portion known as Area C. For those of you who attended the public meeting for Areas A and B several years ago, or have been to any other EPA public meeting, you can see that we have had to make adjustments to our meeting format in an effort to ensure public safety during the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. We hope that you will find this presentation and our outreach methods helpful and informative. The purpose of this virtual public meeting is to provide some background on the NIPSCO Bailey Generating Facility and the work that EPA has overseen in Area C. We'll provide you with details about the investigation, as well as the cleanup plan that is being proposed as a result. The purpose of every EPA Statement of Basis is to gather the public's comments and questions about the proposed cleanup. After a 45-day public comment period, we will provide responses in a document referred to as the Final Decision Document. There are many ways you can submit your questions or comments to the EPA. First, you can submit a comment directly on this website. Next, you can leave a confidential voicemail at 312-886-6015 or fax your comments directly to my inbox at 312-697-2568. You can also email me at safakis.kirsten@epa.gov. That's SAFAKAS.KIRSTIN@epa.gov. Or finally, you can mail me a hard copy statement to Kirsten Safakis at the U.S. EPA, 77 West Jackson Boulevard, 19th floor, in Chicago, Illinois, 60604. We recognize that you may have questions regarding the proposed cleanup plan after watching our presentation. We would like to invite you to call us during an open Q&A session to be held on Monday, August 3rd from 6 to 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. The dial-in number for that session is 312-667-5632, and the conference code is 1344648. Once again, that number is 312-667-5632 with the conference code of 1344648. We will now start our presentation on the proposed cleanup. I will hand it over to the EPA project manager who has been working on this site for almost 15 years, Ms. Michelle Kaysen.
Hi, again, my name is Michelle Kaysen, and I'm the EPA project manager. The Bailey site has been undergoing corrective action since 2005. The site is located in Chesterton, Indiana, on the southern shore of Lake Michigan. It's approximately 15 miles east of the U.S. Steel facility and approximately 15 miles west of Michigan City, Indiana. As most of you may know, NIPSCO has another facility in Michigan City. That site is not part of this proposed cleanup and is currently undergoing closure with the state's oversight. The Bailey site is adjacent to the ArcelorMittal Burns Harbor facility on the west and south, and the Indiana Dunes National Park on the east and north. Bailey started operating as a coal-fired power plant in 1962 and recently closed in 2018. As part of their Your Energy, Your Future campaign, NIPSCO is retiring aging coal-fired power plants and striving to reduce their carbon emissions by more than 90% by 2028. NIPSCO currently has 3 wind energy projects underway, and by 2028 plans to produce electricity with 25% natural gas 65% renewables, and 10% other sources. This plan eliminates coal from NIPSCO's energy portfolio. EPA has been overseeing the work at the Bailey site under what's called a RCRA Corrective Action Order. The Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, or RCRA law, was created in an effort to prevent future Superfund sites. Superfund sites often utilize EPA resources, and therefore taxpayer dollars, to conduct investigations and cleanups. RCRA seeks to prevent the additional use of taxpayer dollars by addressing potentially contaminated sites while the site is still active. We are not authorized by law to use taxpayer dollars on these sites, so EPA oversees the work and cleanups that are conducted by the responsible party, NIPSCO in this case. A responsible party is legally obligated to follow EPA guidance and must receive EPA approval on all elements of the project. During the corrective action process, sites undergo an environmental investigation that studies where possible contamination is, where it may have moved to, what impacts that contamination has made, and what risks are being posed by it to either people or the environment. At Bailey, the site was divided into 3 areas of investigation. By doing so, areas A and B could more quickly get through the corrective action process, and Area C could be studied more intensely. Area A included the areas of active work, including coal storage, burning, and electricity generation. Area B included the center of the site where the surface impoundments, or ponds, are present. The ponds in Area B will be closed along with the rest of the site under state oversight. It's anticipated those activities will occur over the next 5 years or so. Area C includes the on-site area that was used in the 60s and 70s to dispose of coal combustion residual, also called coal ash or CCR, and is the main subject of this proposed cleanup. Unlike the ponds, this disposal area was not a regulated unit, but rather a historic disposal area that functioned like a landfill. However, the area was not engineered to receive waste back in the 60s, and so has become a source of contamination. This figure shows the areas that were ultimately studied as part of the Area C investigation. When a facility investigation is initiated at a corrective action site, areas known to have been used to store or dispose of waste are identified. Those areas are referred to as Solid Waste Management Units, or SWMUs. Other areas of suspected impacts are referred to as Areas of Concern, or AOCs. As investigations progress, data is sequentially collected in a phased approach. Any location where contamination is found above a screening level is further defined by sampling out in all directions until that area of impact is completely defined. Screening levels are designed to be extremely low numbers that err on the side of caution. There are screening levels that are intended to compare screening results for the purpose of human health, and different levels looking at the environment, such as wildlife. When a sample is above a screening level, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's causing any harm or presenting a risk. It means that the collected data needs to move on to the next phase of study, a risk assessment. Risk assessments are used in many fields of study and are used to determine the specific type and the amount of risk in a given scenario. The Area C studies demonstrated a range of potential risks. For example, there was no risk found to human health after all the screening levels and possible receptors were studied. Again, to err on the side of caution, receptors included site workers, construction workers, park workers and visitors, and even teen volunteers who might be working in the park. The ecological risk assessment, however, did demonstrate risk to certain receptors in the park from the area labeled SWMU 15. The main risk driver is the element boron and the impacts to the sensitive plant communities in the national park. The impacted area is outlined purple on the slide. EPA's highest priority during this investigation was the national park. The Indiana Dunes represent a globally rare dune and swale environment. Nowhere other than in the Great Lakes area did historic glaciers form this type of ecosystem. The advance and retreat of the glacier formed high ridges of sand, the dunes. In between these ridges are low-lying areas, sometimes fed water by the groundwater beneath them. The water that exists underground, called groundwater, is shallow enough in these areas to reach the surface and create wetlands. The unique nature of this area has created habitat for 30% of Indiana's rare and endangered species. The Indiana Dunes were formally designated a national lakeshore previously, but was recently re-designated as our nation's 61st national park. The Area C investigation was a multimedia, multi-year effort. Hundreds of samples were collected from the various areas. EPA worked closely with the National Park Service and the scientists at the dunes during this time. EPA's Ecological Risk Assessor, Jennifer Dodds, will briefly discuss the scope of the investigation and the conclusions reached after the data analysis.
Thanks, Michelle. Again, my name is Jennifer Dodds, and I'm an Ecological Risk Assessor with EPA. The Area C investigation was a series of complex, time-consuming studies designed to determine any potential impacts to the dunes. Not only was the environmental media, like soil and water, sampled, but studies were also conducted on plants and amphibians in the park. The data collected from those studies were then evaluated in a risk assessment. The risk assessment process compares sampling data to conservative screening levels and uses scientific literature to better understand the potential risks at a site. In Area C, EPA concluded the combination of sampling results, the level of uncertainty associated with studies of this nature, and the sensitivity of the national park supported the need for a risk management decision, or cleanup. Based upon the investigation activities and the risk assessment, the source of risk to the park is SWMU-15, and the cleanup needed to include some way to stop the contamination from leaving that area.
SWMU-15 is the source of groundwater contamination in the park. Directly in front of the unit, there's an area of groundwater with elevated levels of boron, shown on the next slide. SWMU-15 is a 17-acre area NIPSCO used historically to dispose of coal ash generated from the burning of coal in Area A. Coal ash is the byproduct that's left after burning coal for electricity. Coal is mostly carbon, which is why it's burned, but it also contains an accumulation of naturally occurring elements, mostly metals. After coal is burned, the metals are often left behind in the ash. When ash isn't disposed of properly, it can contaminate the environment with the metals. In order for NIPSCO to understand how SWMU-15 could be addressed, further investigation was needed. SWMU-15 presents a unique challenge because ash is buried underground up to 25 feet deep. Of the approximate 200,000 cubic yards of ash present, about half of it is submerged in groundwater. It's the ash in that underground water that is contributing metals to the park, as the water naturally moves through SWMU-15. The figure on the left shows the limit of the underground ash outlined in yellow, and the area of boron in groundwater outlined in purple. The figure on the right shows the outline of the ash up close. The various dots on this figure show where samples were collected to both define the limit of the ash and take samples for study. As seen on Google Street View, this is the view of SWMU-15 from the hiking trail located in the park. SWMU-15 is largely fenced around its south end. The northern portion of the unit is much more difficult to access due to topography, and fencing becomes impractical. At this location on the trail, a park visitor would turn north and begin walking away from SWMU-15 and towards the lake. The SWMU-15 remedy studies that took place informed the remedy being recommended here today. The first question that needed to be answered was whether or not all of the ash could be removed from SWMU 15 and disposed of at a permitted landfill off-site. Total removal of a source is often EPA's preference. However, as with this site, it's not always possible. The studies taught us that the properties of the ash located below the groundwater would create dangerous working conditions during removal. The ash would be very unstable, and the excavation depth would compound the safety issues. EPA is aware of at least one worker death that happened at another site where unstable ash was being excavated. Another concern about full excavation was the amount of dewatering that would be necessary. Dewatering means the excavation would need to be made dry by pumping all the groundwater out of the area. Because this area is immediately up gradient from sensitive park wetlands that rely on the right balance of water, EPA was concerned about possible long-term impacts to the species in those wetland areas. Once full excavation was eliminated as the recommended remedy, the second question that needed to be answered was, what type of source containment would achieve the remedial goals? The cleanup alternatives that were thoroughly studied and considered are presented here. As discussed, full excavation was the first alternative considered. Various combinations of excavation and on-site consolidation, or disposal, were considered. Other combinations included off-site disposal. In general, it was recognized that building a disposal unit on-site and moving ash from SWMU 15 to somewhere else on-site was not desirable. Given the proximity to the national park, the greatest reduction in volume of ash was more desirable. 2 in situ containment methods were also studied. In situ simply means in place and describes a lot of remedial technologies that are available for contaminated sites. These technologies find ways of reducing or eliminating source areas so that they no longer pose a risk or further contaminate the surrounding area. The 2 methods included encapsulation and solidification stabilization. Encapsulation would entail installing a wall underground all the way around the ash and placing a cap on top of the ground surface. The wall would need to be dug into a natural clay unit underground in order to prevent contamination from seeping out the bottom, and the cap would need to be designed to minimize water infiltration from the top. This approach basically builds a box around the waste like an actual landfill. This remedy proved to be infeasible, though, because the underground clay unit needed to provide a bottom to the box wasn't thick enough or consistent enough to work. The other method that was studied, and is the recommendation EPA is making, is called in situ solidification stabilization, or ISS. ISS is a common containment method, especially when the contamination is saturated and impractical to dig up. ISS mixes binding agents into the contaminated soil to create a low permeability mass. It basically turns the area into a solid mass that is unable to release contamination. The proposed remedy for SWMU 15 includes excavating as much ash as possible, everything above the groundwater, and safely disposing of it off-site at a permitted landfill. The remaining ash that is under groundwater will be solidified. A small area north of SWMU 15 called the Greenbelt, outside the boundary of the SWMU 15 unit, was found to have a small amount of ash. It appears the ash is there unintentionally, likely during placement within SWMU 15, due to its location and volume. This area will be excavated and restored. About 700 cubic yards of contamination and soil will be excavated and disposed of off-site. The area of the national park where metals have been found in the groundwater will be restored with the elimination of the source at SWMU 15. A variety of remedies for the groundwater were discussed and evaluated in consultation with the National Park Service. Because the levels are fairly low and the source will be addressed, the preference was to avoid physically disruptive remedies in the park. The recommendation is to address SWMU 15 and continue monitoring the groundwater to ensure the natural processes already taking place continue. Last, the previously barren soil area north of the Area B settling ponds will also continue to be monitored. Natural restoration of this area is already taking place, and a physically disruptive remedy would not provide benefit. The EPA has established remedy selection criteria in order to assess all remedial alternatives across sites consistently. The 3 threshold criteria must be met in order for an alternative to further be considered. All cleanups must demonstrate the ability to meet these 3 criteria. The 7 balancing criteria are used to further compare and contrast the qualifying alternatives. The balancing criteria provide a way to identify the most effective cleanup strategy while maintaining the flexibility needed to address a wide range of scenarios. The SWMU 15 proposed remedy will address almost 200,000 cubic yards of ash. Over 90,000 cubic yards will be excavated and sent off-site for disposal. Over 85,000 cubic yards will be solidified. The figure on the left shows a cross-section of the unit with the blue line being groundwater. The hatched line, representing the ash above the blue line, will be excavated, and the portion below the blue line will be solidified. The process of solidification will require large equipment and a mixer to work systematically across the area. After multiple studies, the most effective solidification mix of Portland cement was developed. The fixation that will occur has been shown to reduce the permeability of the contaminated area enough to stop contamination from harming the park. The proposed remedy for the groundwater that has been impacted by SWMU 15 relies upon the source control measures that will take place at SWMU 15. Monitored natural attenuation is a remedial alternative that can only be used if source control is in place and the mechanism and rate of attenuation is understood. Extensive studies were conducted in Area C to gather this information. EPA's Office of Research and Development assisted with these studies. It was determined that once the source of contamination was addressed, the chemical processes that are occurring naturally will permanently reverse the boron impacts. The boron, which is a naturally occurring element, will bind to the soil and rock material, actually becoming a part of the mineral structures.
Thank you for participating in this virtual public meeting. As mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, there are multiple ways to submit your public comments on this proposed cleanup plan. You can submit a comment directly on the website. Next, you can leave a confidential voicemail at 312-886-6015 or fax your comments directly to my inbox at 312-697-2568. You can also email me at safakis.kirsten@epa.gov. Or finally, you can mail me a hard copy statement to Kirsten Safakis at the U.S. EPA, 77 West Jackson Boulevard, 19th floor, in Chicago, Illinois, 60604. And of course, if you have any questions or need assistance with submitting your public comment, you can contact either myself or Michelle. Thanks again.